Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something a little different. We are going to slow down, way down. We are going to drift through one of the most misunderstood corners of medieval history, the world of Viking women. Not the raiders, not the warriors with the horned helmets that, by the way, were never actually a thing. No, tonight we are talking about the women who stayed, the women who waited, the women who, honestly, ran everything while the men were out getting dramatically lost at sea or dramatically stabbing each other over fairly minor cattle disputes. Before you get comfortable, though, take just a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure, no guilt, no dramatic music sting, just a gentle nudge from your favorite late-night history companion before we begin. Okay. Now, dim the lights, pull up the blanket, maybe pour something warm, tea maybe, or something slightly stronger if it has been that kind of week, because we are heading to Scandinavia, somewhere around the 9th century, and things are about to get wonderfully, beautifully slow. The Viking Age, broadly speaking, runs from around 793 CE, when Norse raiders famously descended on the monastery at Lindisfarne in northeastern England and absolutely ruined everyone's morning, all the way to roughly 1066, when the Norman conquest of England put a rather firm punctuation mark on the whole era. That is approximately 270 years of raiding, trading, settling, and slowly converting to Christianity while continuing to quietly honor the old gods just in case. 270 years is a long time, long enough for entire generations of women to be born, grow up, manage farms, raise children, brew ale, weave cloth, bury husbands, outlive enemies, and die, all without ever setting foot on a longship, and many of them never wanted to. And that is the part nobody talks about. We spend so much time on the longships, on the raids, on the saga heroes with their dramatic nicknames, Ragnar Lothbrok, Eric Bloodaxe, Ivar the Boneless, which, for the record, historians still argue about what that name actually meant, and the most plausible explanation is deeply, disappointingly mundane. We celebrate the men who left. We celebrate their ambition and their violence and their extraordinary capacity for getting into avoidable conflicts in foreign countries. We forget about the civilization they left behind. And civilizations, it bears repeating, do not sustain themselves. Someone has to tend the fire. Someone has to manage the animals. Someone has to make the decisions when the decision maker is currently somewhere off the coast of Ireland being chased by extremely motivated monks. That someone, more often than not, was a Norse woman. So tonight we are going to meet some of them. We are going to wander very slowly through their world, their longhouses, their farms, their legal rights, their graves, their myths, their magic, their trade, their children, their gods, their grief. And we are going to understand, quietly and gently, that Viking women were not passive figures waiting decoratively for their husbands to come home. They were, in many ways, the structural backbone of an entire civilization, the load-bearing walls, the organizational infrastructure. They just did not get the sagas written about them, most of them anyway. And the ones who did get sagas written about them did not always get treated fairly by the writers. Let us begin at the very beginning, with the world these women were born into, with the landscape itself. Scandinavia in the 9th century is cold, rugged, and beautiful in the kind of way that absolutely does not care about your comfort. This is a landscape of extremes, fjords cutting deep into mountainsides, their water dark and still in the early morning, reflecting the mountains above them with unsettling accuracy. Forests that go on so long they stop feeling like forests and start feeling like a state of mind. Coastlines that are so jagged and complicated that navigating them is itself a skill, one that Norse sailors developed over generations to a degree of mastery that would not be matched in Northern Europe for centuries. Winters in Scandinavia are long and genuinely dark, not metaphorically dark, actually dark. The sun goes away for weeks. In the far north, above the Arctic Circle, it does not come back at all for stretches of time that seem, to anyone raised in moderate latitudes, genuinely alarming. This darkness was not just an inconvenience. It shaped daily life, seasonal rhythms, food preservation strategies, the timing of travel, the structure of social gatherings, and, perhaps most relevantly for our purposes tonight, the organization of indoor labor. In the dark months, you stayed inside. You worked by firelight. You wove. You told stories. You planned for spring. In this landscape, every farm was a kind of small world unto itself. The Norse called it a bu, a farmstead. Each bu was a self-contained economic unit. It produced most of what it consumed, traded for what it could not produce, and managed its own affairs with a degree of independence that was partly practical, neighbors were often not close, and partly philosophical. Norse culture placed enormous value on individual and family self-sufficiency. You didn't ask for help unless you needed it. You helped your neighbors because someday you would need them to help you. The bu was the center of this world, and the person who ran the bu when the male head of household was away, on a raid, on a trading voyage, at the thing, or simply traveling, was called the husfreyja, the house lady, the mistress of the home. And before you imagine something small and decorative, someone who sat by the fire and embroidered things while waiting to be rescued from the plot, let us be very clear. Managing a Norse farmstead was essentially running a small corporation with livestock in the snow, without any of the infrastructure that makes modern management remotely possible. The husfreyja oversaw food production, textile production, the management of thralls, that is, enslaved workers, the storage of goods, the preservation of food for winter, the hospitality of guests, the education of children in practical skills, the treatment of the sick and injured, the management of seasonal labor, the negotiation of trade with visiting merchants, and the general social and economic functioning of the entire property. She was, simultaneously, the head of operations, the head of human resources, the head of logistics, and the head of guest services. And she did all of this without a salary, without a title other than husfreyja, and without anyone particularly asking whether she found it fulfilling. She held the keys to the household stores, literally the keys. A large iron key ring hanging from the belt, often quite heavy because a well-stocked Norse farmstead had a lot of things that needed to be locked, was a recognizable symbol of a Norse woman's authority. It was the material embodiment of her role, and archaeologists have found these key rings in women's graves across Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, and Iceland, which tells us that this authority was considered important enough to carry into the afterlife. You took your keys with you, just in case. That is not a small thing. That is a statement about identity and power that transcends the centuries quite effectively.
Let us stay with those keys for a moment, because they matter more than they might first appear, and the world they unlocked was more complex than most people realize. In a society where resources were survival, where getting through winter meant having enough preserved food, enough wool, enough firewood, enough grain, enough ale, enough of absolutely everything, the person who controlled access to those resources held genuine practical power. And in Norse households, that person was the woman of the house. The key ring she wore was not decorative, it was functional. It unlocked the storage chests where the preserved meat and dried fish and salted goods were kept. It unlocked the rooms where the household valuables were stored. It unlocked the pantry and the beer cellar and the locked boxes where the silver was kept, because Norse people kept silver in locked boxes because they were sensible. The key ring was the physical embodiment of economic authority. Without it, nothing moved. And Norse law recognized this in ways that were, for the medieval period, genuinely remarkable. Norse women had legal rights that would not be matched in many parts of Europe for centuries. They could own property in their own names. They could inherit property from family members. They could enter into contracts. They could be witnesses in legal proceedings. They could manage estates independently. They could travel without requiring male permission, and most strikingly for a medieval society, they could divorce their husbands. Not just separate from them, not just move to a different part of the house, actually legally dissolve the marriage, recover their property, and move on with their lives. Norse divorce law was not identical to modern no-fault divorce. There were accepted grounds, and the process was formal, but it existed. It was used. The sagas record it without particular surprise. A woman who was unhappy in her marriage had a legal option. That option was exercised. The community acknowledged it. Life continued. The specific mechanisms of Norse divorce were interestingly theatrical. A woman wishing to end her marriage was required to announce her intention before witnesses, first at the couple's bed, specifically the marital bed, in front of witnesses, which must have been an interesting morning for everyone involved, and then at the main door of the house, and then at the local assembly, the thing. 3 announcements, 3 public declarations. After these formalities, the marriage was legally dissolved, the wife recovered her property, and the matter was concluded. It was not easy exactly. It required courage and determination and a willingness to make your private life very publicly known, but it was possible. The accepted grounds for Norse divorce covered more situations than you might expect. A husband who consistently failed to provide for the household, who was economically feckless, essentially, was grounds. A husband who was impotent was grounds. A husband who appeared in public wearing clothing considered inappropriate for his gender, which tells you something about Norse gender anxieties running in rather specific directions, was grounds. A husband who was too violent beyond what was socially considered acceptable was grounds. A husband who had been absent for too long without word was grounds. Now, we should not over-romanticize any of this. Norse society was deeply hierarchical, and a woman's experience of these rights depended enormously on her social class, her marital status, the personality of her husband, the attitudes of her family, and the specific region and time period we are discussing. Freeborn Norse women had considerably more legal standing than thrall women, who had essentially none. Even free women operated within a fundamentally patriarchal system where fathers, husbands, and male relatives held significant authority over marriage decisions, property transfers, and public life. But within those constraints, Norse women had more room to maneuver than their contemporaries in, say, contemporary Frankish Europe, where the Church's influence was making divorce increasingly impossible for anyone who was not a king with enough political leverage to pressure the Pope. Or in Anglo-Saxon England, where a woman's legal identity was largely subsumed into her husband's, or in the Byzantine Empire, where the law code was sophisticated, but the social reality for women could be quite different. The evidence for Norse women's legal status is not just in the legal texts, many of which were written down after the Viking Age proper and may reflect the compromises of Christianization. It is in the graves, it is in the rune stones, it is in the incidental details of saga literature that treat women's economic agency as completely unremarkable, which is itself remarkable. Women's graves from the Viking Age are frequently, consistently, impressively well furnished, not just with personal jewelry, though there is plenty of that, but with the tools and equipment of productive labor. Weaving tools, the loom weights, the spindles, the needles, the pin beaters used to compact woven thread, food production equipment, knives, bowls, cooking implements, agricultural tools, and the keys, always the keys. This was not accidental. Norse burial practice reflected the identity and status of the deceased in life. You buried people with what defined them, and what defined a Norse woman of standing, apparently, was her authority over her household and her productive skills. In some women's graves, we also find scales and weights, the equipment of trade. In a society that ran significantly on silver bullion, measured by weight rather than by coinage denomination, a set of scales was valuable and important. Finding them in a woman's grave tells us that some women were involved in trade and commerce at a level that was considered central to their identity, not just as observers or domestic managers of a husband's commercial activities, but as participants. This will matter when we get to the trading centers, because Norse women in places like Hedeby and Birka and Dublin were not sitting at home while the merchants did their work. They were part of the commercial world in ways that the traditional story of the Viking Age doesn't usually leave room for. Let us drift for a moment to the archaeological find that changed how many people think about Viking Age women. Not a living woman, an excavated one. The Oseberg burial. In 1904, the main excavation was actually in 1904, not 1989, as I sometimes mix up. The farmer initially identified the mound in 1903. A Norwegian farmer near the town of Tonsberg discovered something remarkable buried in a ship mound on his property. What followed was one of the most spectacular and influential excavations in Norse history. The Oseberg ship was a Viking longship, ornately carved, in extraordinary preservation because of the peculiar qualities of the blue clay in which it was buried. And inside it were the remains of two women. Two women in a ship burial of extraordinary wealth and complexity. The ship itself was a masterpiece of Norse craftsmanship, 15 meters long, clinker-built in the Norse style, with elaborate animal head carvings decorating the prow. Inside the burial cabin built on deck were the two women, along with an inventory of grave goods that still makes archaeologists slightly breathless to describe. 15 horses, 6 dogs, 2 oxen, 3 sleds, one of them richly carved. A 4-wheeled wagon, the only complete example of a Viking Age wagon ever found. Beds, chests, tapestries, fragments of woven textile that represent some of the most important surviving examples of Norse weaving. Kitchen equipment, seeds and nuts and other organic materials, iron tools, wooden objects, leather objects, more objects than a fairly detailed museum exhibit. The older of the two women had been in considerable physical pain for years before her death. She had severe arthritis in her spine and other joints. She had a healed fracture in her arm. She had what appears to have been a form of cancer. Of course she did. Whoever this woman was, she had been living with significant physical suffering, and whoever buried her thought she deserved to take an entire ship full of treasures into the afterlife anyway. The younger of the two women's identity and relationship to the older one remains debated. Companion, thrall woman killed to accompany her mistress, relative, we do not know. The peat that preserved so much of the organic material did not preserve enough DNA for conclusive analysis in the early excavations, and later attempts have been complicated by the condition of the remains. But whoever these women were, they were important. The Oseberg burial is comparable in elaborateness and expense to the great male burials of the period. Someone spent an enormous amount of resources to send these women off properly, and that tells us that the category of powerful, important, worthy of honor was not exclusively male in Viking Age Scandinavia. It was just that the women who achieved that status often achieved it through channels and roles that later historians, with their focus on warfare and raiding, tended to overlook.
Let us step away from the graves and the legal texts for a moment. Let us try to actually inhabit a day in the life of an ordinary Norse woman. Not a queen, not a vulva, not a saga heroine, just a woman. A free woman of modest means, living on a farm somewhere in Norway or Denmark or Sweden, sometime in the 9th or 10th century. Let us call her Ragnhild, because it is a good Norse name and it flows well. Ragnhild wakes before everyone else. This is not a choice exactly, it is the logic of the household. The fire needs to be started or rebuilt from the embers of the night before. The animals need water and feed. The day does not begin when the sun rises, because in winter the sun does not rise for a very long time after you would want it to. The day begins when Ragnhild decides it begins, which is early, which is always. The longhouse is cold in the morning. The central hearth, the long fire that runs down the middle of the building, has banked low overnight. Ragnhild rebuilds it with the methodical efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times. She knows exactly where the draft comes from, exactly how to arrange the wood, exactly how much to feed the fire at different stages to get it going quickly without wasting fuel. Wood is not infinite. Peat, in many parts of Scandinavia, was the primary fuel source, and peat has its own particular properties as a fuel. It burns steadily but slowly. It smells a certain way. It requires specific management. Ragnhild knows all of this in her body, the way you know things you have done every day since childhood. The long house that Ragnhild lives in is probably between 20 and 30 meters long. It is built of wood, with walls that may be partly turf on the exterior for insulation. The roof is thatched, or in some regions covered with turf. The floor is packed earth, perhaps covered with straw or planking in the living areas. Along the long walls are raised platforms, benches that serve as seating during the day and sleeping surfaces at night, covered with furs and woven blankets. In winter, the animals, the cattle, the sheep, possibly horses, are in one end of the building. Ragnhild has learned to sleep through the sounds of cattle shifting in their stalls, the way people who live near water learn to sleep through the sound of it. The morning routine involves animals, always animals. Norse farms kept cattle for milk and meat and labor, sheep for wool and milk and meat, pigs, chickens, possibly goats. The care of these animals, feeding, watering, milking, mucking out, was divided between household members according to age and ability, but the overall responsibility for making sure it happened fell to Ragnhild. She did not necessarily do all of it herself. She directed, she checked. She knew which cow was giving less milk than expected and why, which sheep had a limp that needed watching, which pig was behaving oddly. The milking was women's work, and it happened twice a day. Norse dairy culture was sophisticated. They produced not just fresh milk, but skyr, a strained dairy product similar to what is still produced and consumed in Iceland today, as well as butter and various forms of preserved cheese. Dairy production was a significant part of the Norse diet, particularly in the warmer months when fresh milk was available, and managing it well was a genuine skill. The fermentation processes involved in making skyr, for instance, required knowledge that was passed down through generations, maintained by women, and not particularly well understood even by the people practicing it. They knew what to do, just not always why it worked. Breakfast in a Norse household was probably bread if there was grain, and porridge, and dairy products. The bread was dense and nutritious and, as we noted earlier, full of grit from the millstones that ground the grain, which is why Norse teeth show so much wear. Making bread involved grinding grain. Hand-powered rotary querns were the technology available, and grinding enough grain for a family was a significant daily labor. It was women's work, mostly. Ragnhild has been grinding grain since she was old enough to help her mother do it, and she will be grinding grain until she is too old or too ill to continue. After the morning tasks, if there is time, and there usually is not much, Ragnhild might eat something herself. Norse women tended to eat after the men and children in the household were fed, which was the pattern across most of early medieval Northern Europe. She ate what was left. She did not complain about this because it was normal. Complaining about normal things is a luxury of people with time to reflect. And then the textile work begins, because it never really stops.
If there is one activity that defined the daily experience of Viking-age women across every social class, every region, every time period within the era, it is textile production. Spinning and weaving were not hobbies or side projects. They were constants. They were the background music of a Norse woman's entire life.
From the time she was old enough to hold a spindle, which was young, perhaps 5 or 6 years old for the lightest tasks, to the time she was too ill to continue, a Norse woman spun thread, every spare moment. Walking, sitting, talking, resting, waiting, the spindle was always in hand. The process of turning raw wool into finished cloth was long, complicated, and entirely human-powered at every stage. It began with the sheep, obviously. Sheep were sheared in late spring, and the raw fleece needed to be cleaned, sorted, and prepared. The cleaning involved washing out the lanolin and dirt. The sorting involved separating the different grades of wool, longer, stronger fibers for weaving, shorter fibers for other uses. Then came carding or combing, running the fiber through a tool with metal teeth to align and fluff it for spinning. Then came the actual spinning, which transformed the prepared fiber into thread using a drop spindle, a weighted stick that the spinner twisted while drawing out the fiber. Then came the weaving, on a large warp-weighted loom, which required skill and physical effort and attention. Then came the finishing, beating, washing, stretching, sometimes fulling the cloth to felt it slightly and make it denser. And all of this was done by hand. There were no shortcuts. There was no mechanization. The Norse textile industry ran entirely on human labor, and the humans providing that labor were overwhelmingly women. The warp-weighted loom that dominated Norse weaving is a fascinating piece of technology. It works by hanging threads vertically from a horizontal beam, weighted at the bottom by clay or stone weights, the loom weights that archaeologists find in enormous quantities at Norse settlement sites. The weaver stands at the loom and passes the weft thread horizontally through the warp threads, building the cloth upward. It produces excellent fabric, but it requires the weaver to stand for hours every day. This is not a small physical commitment. Norse women wove for domestic use, clothing for the family, blankets and furs for sleeping, curtains and wall hangings, bags and pouches for storage, ropes and cords for every conceivable purpose. And they wove the trade. Norse textiles were exported. The evidence for this comes from finds of Norse-style fabrics in locations far from Scandinavia and from references in documentary sources to the trade in cloth. The fabric that Norse households produced was not just for internal consumption, it was a commodity with market value. And then there are the sails. The great woolen sails of Viking longships, which made those ships capable of crossing the North Atlantic. A single sail for a large longship might require 200 square meters of tightly woven fabric. 200 square meters, hand-spun thread, hand-woven on warp-weighted looms. The production of a single sail represented an enormous investment of labor, hundreds, perhaps thousands of hours of spinning and weaving. Every voyage the Norse made across the North Sea, across the North Atlantic to Iceland and Greenland and North America, depended on sails that women had made. Without the textile labor of Norse women, there are no voyages. Without the voyages, there is no Viking Age in the form we know it. Nobody put that on the runestones, but it is true. The economic importance of textile production to Norse society is reflected in the legal and social valuation placed on weaving skill. A woman who was an excellent weaver was respected for a practical, economically significant capability. The tools of weaving were considered valuable enough to be buried as brave goods. And the specific responsibilities of the husfreyja included oversight of all textile production in the household, which meant not just doing the work herself, but organizing and directing the work of other women and girls in the household, ensuring that the family's textile needs were met and that surplus production was available for trade. This was management, logistical economic management. The husfreyja was not just weaving, she was running a small textile operation and doing it alongside everything else she was responsible for. The next time someone describes Viking-age women as sitting by the fire while their husbands had all the interesting adventures, you might gently suggest that those adventures were partly funded and entirely equipped by the women sitting by the fire.
Beyond textiles and food production, Norse women were responsible for two other essential areas of household management that rarely get the attention they deserve: brewing and healing. Let us take them in order. Ale production in Norse society was not a commercial enterprise, at least not primarily. It was a domestic necessity. The Norse drank ale with every meal. Children drank it. It was not particularly strong by modern standards. The alcohol content was low, often around 2 to 3%, but it was ubiquitous. And the reason was practical. Water sources in early medieval Scandinavia, as in most of early medieval Europe, were frequently contaminated. Springs and streams might be fine. Rivers near settlements might not be. Wells could be problematic. Ale, because it was brewed, heated, fermented, was considerably safer than untreated water. Ale was the daily beverage of Norse households, and making it was the responsibility of the woman of the house. Norse brewing used malted barley as the primary grain, barley that had been allowed to partially sprout, activating the enzymes that convert starch to fermentable sugar, and then dried to stop the sprouting. This malted barley was mashed with hot water, filtered, and then fermented with the addition of yeast, which Norse brewers maintained through a continuous process, keeping active fermentation going so there was always yeast available for the next batch. Flavoring agents included juniper berries, yarrow, and other herbs. Hops, which dominate modern beer, were not widely used in Scandinavia until later in the medieval period. A Norse woman managing a household needed to keep ale production running at all times. There was always another batch that needed to be started, another that needed to be monitored, another that was ready to drink. The timing mattered. Ale does not keep indefinitely. You made what you needed and you used it, and then you made more. The management of this constant cycle, alongside everything else the Husfreyja was doing, is part of what makes the scope of her responsibilities genuinely impressive. For special occasions, the great feasts of the North Year, the religious celebrations, the gatherings of the Thing, ale was produced in larger quantities and sometimes with more care for quality. The person who produced the ale for a feast was performing a hospitality function that was socially significant. Norse hospitality culture placed enormous emphasis on generosity with food and drink. A host who fed guests poorly was a failed host. The Husfreyja who kept the household supplied with good ale and fed guests abundantly was contributing directly to her family's social reputation. Now for healing. Norse society did not have hospitals or professional physicians in any form we would recognize. Medical care was provided within the household, primarily by women. And while Norse medicine was not entirely separate from magic, there was a strong overlap between medical knowledge and magical practice, which we will come to. It also had a substantial practical, empirical component. Norse women knew plants. The identification, collection, drying, and storage of medicinal herbs was part of the domestic knowledge base that passed from mother to daughter over generations. Yarrow for wound treatment, juniper for digestive complaints, various plants for fever management. The Norse medical vocabulary, preserved in later sources, suggests a sophisticated understanding of the body's symptoms and the plants that could address them. It was not scientific medicine in any modern sense, but it was not random either. It was accumulated empirical knowledge, observations made and passed down over generations about what helped and what did not. Wound care was a significant medical responsibility. Norse society was violent, not just in raiding, but in everyday life, where disputes could turn physical, where farming accidents happened, where childbirth was dangerous. Treating wounds, cleaning them, packing them,
managing infection, monitoring recovery. This was women's work in the Norse household. And some women were recognized as particularly skilled healers, their expertise known within the community and sought from outside it. The archaeological evidence for Norse medicine includes finds of medical instruments in women's graves, implements that appear designed for specific medical procedures. It includes finds of medicinal plant material in burial contexts, and it includes the saga literature's consistent presentation of women as the primary healers in Norse households. When a saga character is seriously injured, it is usually a woman who treats them. When a saga character is poisoned or ill, it is usually a woman who identifies the problem and knows what to do about it. There is also a type of woman in the saga literature called a leiknadis, a healing woman, sometimes with overtones of magical healing ability. She is distinct from the vulva, though the categories could overlap. She is defined by practical healing skill, and she is respected for it. Childbirth itself was entirely a women's domain. Midwifery, the management of labor and delivery, was practiced by experienced older women within the community. There was no male medical involvement. The birthing room, so to speak, was a female space. And given that childbirth in the pre-antibiotic era was genuinely dangerous for both the mother and the child, the women who managed it were practicing a genuinely high-stakes form of medicine with no backup if things went wrong. Norse women had more children than survived to adulthood. This was normal in medieval society. Childhood mortality was high, particularly in the first years of life. Women buried children. They nursed them through illnesses. They watched some of them die from infections and accidents and circumstances that modern medicine would address easily. And then they had more children, because the farm needed labor, and the family needed heirs, and the Norse cosmological framework provided a context, not necessarily a comforting one, but a context for the fact that life was short and uncertain, and the Norns wove what they wove without consulting you about your preferences. Grief was a real part of Norse women's lives. The sagas are not sentimental about this, but they acknowledge it. Women in the sagas mourn their dead. They lament, they grieve, and then they continue, because there is no alternative to continuing. The animals still need feeding. The ale still needs brewing. The thread still needs spinning. Life is relentless in its demands on the living, which is both a burden and, in a grim way, a kind of mercy.
Norse society placed enormous value on hospitality. This was not merely a matter of good manners, it was a social obligation with legal and moral weight. A traveler who arrived at a Norse farmstead could expect to be housed and fed, and refusing to provide this hospitality was a genuine social failure with real consequences for the household's reputation. The Norse word for a guest, gesture, carried with it an expectation of welcome that the host was not supposed to deny. Managing this hospitality, preparing the food, overseeing the serving, ensuring that guests were properly accommodated and correctly honored according to their social rank was the husfreyja's responsibility. And Norse feasting culture was complex enough that getting it wrong could be genuinely embarrassing. Who sat where mattered. What food was served in what order mattered. What drink was offered mattered. How guests were addressed and what was said to them mattered. The husfreyja was managing a social interaction with real political and economic stakes at the same time as she was managing the practical logistics of feeding sometimes large numbers of people. The ritual of welcoming a guest involved the husfreyja offering the first drink personally, sometimes from a special cup or horn that was the household's ceremonial vessel. This was not just a practical act, it was a symbolic one. The offering of drink was an act of social and sometimes political significance. In the saga literature, women who offer drink are often doing something more than just being hospitable. They are cementing alliances, asserting the household's status, performing the cultural ritual of welcome in a way that had real meaning. The great feast days of the Norse year, the Glotar, the religious festivals associated with different seasons, involved significant communal gatherings. Yule in the winter, Dísablót in early spring, associated with the female ancestral spirits. Sigurblót at the start of summer. These were occasions for feasting, for sacrifice, for community gathering. Organizing the feast was the women's work. Producing the ale for the feast was the women's work. Ensuring that the hall was properly prepared, that the food was sufficient, that the guests were properly served, all of this fell to the women of the household. Norse feasting culture also had a performative dimension. Skalds, court poets, performed at feasts. Music was played, stories were told. And women participated in this culture, not just as organizers and servers, but as audience and sometimes as participants. The saga literature records women who know the poetic traditions, who appreciate and evaluate skaldic verse, who can hold their own in the verbal culture of Norse halls. This was not a culture where the women left the room after dinner while the men talked about interesting things. Women were in the hall. They heard the stories. They contributed to the conversation. There is also the question of women as skalds, as poets themselves. The Norse skaldic tradition was predominantly male, and the court poets who commemorated battles and praised kings were almost exclusively men. But there is evidence for women who composed poetry. The corpus of Norse verse includes poems attributed to women, though the attribution is sometimes uncertain. And the mythological tradition includes the Eddic poetry, the older, mythologically focused verse, in a mode that was less exclusively male than the skaldic tradition. The ladung or ladung, the formal poetic competition or verbal sparring that was a recognized form of Norse social entertainment, could involve women. The flyting tradition, the ritual exchange of insults and boasts that appears in mythological texts and in saga literature, includes women as participants. Gudrun Jökuldaóttir and Brynhild in the Volsunga saga engage in a verbal contest that escalates into catastrophe. The women's quarrel scene, the Kvennadeila, is a recurring narrative motif, and while the saga tradition is often critical of women who quarrel, the fact that it is such a common narrative suggests that verbal competition between women was a recognized social phenomenon. Norse women, in other words, were not expected to be silent. They were expected to know the culture, participate in it, and be capable of performing in it. The ideal Norse woman was not mute and invisible. She was socially capable, verbally skilled, and knowledgeable enough about the poetic and legal and mythological traditions of her culture to participate in them. The silence was reserved for specific formal contexts. In daily life, in the hall, at feasts, in family gatherings, Norse women talked.
The Norse sagas are a remarkable body of literature. Written down mostly in Iceland between the 12th and 14th centuries, they describe events from the Viking Age, sometimes legendary, sometimes grounded in historical reality, almost always entertaining, with a psychological directness that feels surprisingly contemporary. The saga style is famously laconic. Characters do not tell you how they feel. They act, and other people react, and somehow you know exactly how everyone feels anyway. It is a very economical form of storytelling. Women in the sagas are often more vividly drawn than their male counterparts. This is a genuine observation, not flattery. The saga writers seem to find women more interesting to write, or perhaps more challenging, or perhaps they recognize that women's power, operating through indirect channels, through speech, through memory, through the cultivation of alliances, through the patient waiting for exactly the right moment, was more dramatically interesting than straightforward violence. The Norse had a word for a particular kind of forceful, decisive woman, hvatar. It meant something like bold, decisive, energetic, formidable. It was a compliment. And the sagas are full of hvatar women who drive events from the background, or sometimes very much from the foreground, depending on the woman and the circumstances and how tired she was of waiting for the men to sort things out on their own. Let us spend some time with Gudrun Osvivsdottir, the central figure of Laxdæla saga. Gudrun is one of the most memorable characters in all of Old Norse literature. She is beautiful, intelligent, ambitious, emotionally complex, and absolutely unforgiving in ways that are impressive even by saga standards. She is introduced through a prophetic dream sequence. She dreams 4 dreams about her 4 marriages, and a wise man interprets each dream before she understands what it means. The first dream shows her wearing a headdress that does not suit her and throwing it away into a lake. The interpretation, her first husband will not suit her either, and she will leave him, which she does. She divorces him using the Norse law mechanisms we discussed earlier, citing as her grounds the fact that he wore a shirt with a low neckline, which Norse law classified as a form of gender transgression. Whether this was the real reason or a convenient legal mechanism is left to the reader to determine. Probably it was a convenient legal mechanism. Gudrun marries 4 times. She loves one man, Kjartan Olafsson, brilliant and handsome, and gone to Norway for years at the crucial moment, and is married to another. The story of Gudrun and Kjartan and Boli, the man she marries while Kjartan is away, is one of the central tragic structures of the saga. Boli kills Kjartan at Gudrun's urging, and Gudrun lives with this for the rest of her life. In her old age, her son Boli the peacock, a different Boli, her son, asks her who she loved most in all her life. She says quietly and without hesitation, "I was worst to the one I loved the most." That line has been haunting readers for 800 years. Gudrun is not typical. She is a saga heroine, which means she is extraordinary by definition. But the attributes assigned to her, the emotional intelligence, the strategic thinking, the long memory, the willingness to act decisively even at catastrophic personal cost, are not presented as impossible or freakish in the saga tradition. They are presented as the fully realized expression of a particular Norse female type, the hvatar woman, taken to her logical extreme. Then there is Bergþóra Njalsdottir, the wife of Njal in Njal saga, generally considered one of the greatest of all the Icelandic sagas. Bergþóra is formidable in a quieter way than Gudrun. She is a manager, an organizer, a keeper of grievances and ledgers. She and Hallgerð Höskuldsdottir, her husband's enemy's wife, conduct a years-long feud in parallel with their husband's feud, each ordering killings in response to killings, in a cycle of escalation that illustrates, with grim efficiency, how Norse feud dynamics worked when both sides were equally determined. Bergþóra's final moment in the saga is one of the most emotionally powerful passages in Old Norse literature. When Njal's enemies burn the family farm with everyone inside, Njal tells his wife to flee. She is innocent of the main dispute. She can go. She can survive. Bergþóra refuses to leave. She says calmly and without hesitation, "I was given to Njal in marriage young, and I promised him that we would share the same fate." She lies down beside her husband and her grandson, and she dies in the burning house. The saga records this without excessive commentary. It doesn't need any. The character speaks for herself. Aud, the deep-minded, also called depending on the source, deserves more time than I gave her in the previous version of this story, because she is genuinely one of the most interesting figures in all of Norse history, and her story deserves to be told slowly. Aud was born in Norway, the daughter of a chieftain called Ketil Flatnose. Her first husband was a Norse king in Ireland named Olaf the White. Her son, Thorstein the Red, was a warrior king in Scotland who conquered significant portions of the country in allyship with the Orcadian earls before being betrayed and killed. By the time Thorstein died, Aud was in her 50s or older, a widow in a foreign country with no male protector and a household full of dependents, grandchildren, and former thralls who had served her family. Another woman, a woman of less determination, less organizational capability, less fundamental unflappability, might have accepted a diminished position, remarried quickly for protection, relied on relatives, waited for circumstances to improve. Aud organized the construction of a ship in secret in Scotland without announcing her plans. She gathered her household, loaded the ship, and sailed first to Orkney and then to the Faroe Islands, settling relatives along the way, and then across the open North Atlantic to Iceland, which had only recently been settled and where land was available. Aud arrived in Iceland with a substantial household, claimed a large territory in the west of the island, and proceeded to establish herself as a landowner of considerable standing. The saga notes that she freed the enslaved members of her household and gave them land. This was unusual enough that it was worth recording. She allocated land to her freed thralls, to her followers, to her grandchildren. She organized the settlement of an entire region. When she died, in a feast she had organized herself, seated in her high chair, having drunk and spoken with her guests throughout the evening, she died on her own terms, in her own hall, as she had lived. The saga says she was buried in a ship in the intertidal zone at the water's edge because she had said she did not wish to lie in consecrated ground. She had been in contact with Christianity during her time in the British Isles and was not entirely opposed to it, but she was not entirely committed to it either. She wanted to be buried where she had always been most at home, at the meeting of land and sea. Aud the Deep-Minded crossed the North Atlantic twice in her 50s with a household of dependents and established herself as a founding settler of Iceland. Her descendants are traceable through the Icelandic sagas and genealogies. If you are Icelandic, there's a reasonable chance you are descended from Aud the Deep-Minded, 1,000 years on. She did not think of herself as extraordinary, probably. She thought of herself as someone doing what needed to be done. That may be the most Norse thing about her.
The thing, the Old Norse thing, was the assembly, the gathering of free community members where legal disputes were settled, laws were declared, alliances were made, and collective decisions were reached. Every Norse community had its local thing, meeting several times a year. There were regional assemblies, and in Iceland, beginning in 930 CE, there was the All-Thing, the National Assembly that met at Thingvellir in the southwest of the island for 2 weeks each summer, bringing together the leading families from all regions of Iceland to conduct the legal and political business of the community. The All-Thing is still functioning today in a significantly evolved form as the Icelandic Parliament. This makes it one of the oldest continuously operating parliamentary institutions in the world, which is the kind of fact that sounds impressive at normal speeds and is particularly satisfying to mention at the pace we are going tonight. Women could not vote at the Thing. They did not hold formal speaking rights in the legal assembly. The Thing, in its primary political function, was organized around the participation of free male householders, the Gothar and their followers, making decisions through a combination of consensus, argument, and the credible threat of violence. Women were not part of this formal structure. But women were present. The Thing was not just a law court. It was a fair, a market, a social gathering, a place where people met people they had not seen since the previous summer,
where goods were bought and sold, where marriages were arranged, where alliances were formed over the course of 2 social weeks during the brief Icelandic summer. Women attended, women traded, women socialized and observed and gathered information and formed opinions that they would carry home and act on. And in legal matters that touched directly on their own lives, women had mechanisms for participation. A woman involved in a property dispute, a divorce proceeding, an inheritance question could appoint a male advocate, a legal representative, who would argue her case formally at the thing, while she directed the strategy from a position that was technically outside the formal assembly, but practically very close to it. The advocate spoke, but he spoke what she told him to speak. Women could also be witnesses to certain categories of event, particularly those that fell within the domestic sphere. Events that happened in and around the household that women were present for and men were not required female testimony. The birth of children, establishing paternity and legitimacy, required female witnesses. The deathbed statements of individuals who died in their homes were often witnessed by women who could testify to what was said. In all these cases, women's word carried legal weight. The rune stones of Scandinavia are another form of public statement, one that women made consistently and visibly. Rune stones were expensive, carved stone monuments, often large and elaborately decorated, inscribed with runic letters that recorded names and family relationships, and sometimes brief narrative details. They were erected at roadsides, at fords, at prominent landscape features, wherever they would be seen by travelers and community members. They were a form of permanent public record. Women commissioned rune stones in significant numbers. They commissioned them to commemorate husbands, brothers, fathers, sons. They commissioned them to mark property and family claims. The formula of a rune stone inscription, X raised this stone in memory of Y, when X is a woman's name, is a public statement of identity. She is there. She has the resources to commission a stone. She is claiming her grief and her family relationship in a form that will outlast her by centuries. And indeed, these stones have outlasted her by centuries. Her name is still on them. We can still read it. Some of the most moving runestone inscriptions are those raised by women whose husbands died far from home. He died in the East. He fell in England. He went to Cirkland and did not return. These brief, dry statements of loss, carved in stone, on roads for everyone to see, are the most permanent grief monuments from the Viking Age. The women who commissioned them were making their loss public, in a culture that valued emotional restraint and expected the bereaved to maintain their composure even in the face of catastrophic loss. They could not weep in the saga way, collapsed and dramatic. They could, however, have someone carve the loss in stone and set it at the roadside where it would stand for 1,000 years, which it has.
Norse trading culture is one of the most remarkable aspects of the Viking Age, and it has been somewhat overshadowed in the popular imagination by the raiding culture. The Norse were traders of extraordinary range and sophistication. They established trade routes that connected Scandinavia to the British Isles in the west, to France and the Frankish Empire in the south, to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates through the river routes of Russia in the east, and to the Arctic in the north, where they traded for furs, walrus ivory, and eiderdown with the Sami people who had lived there before them and would live there after them. The great Norse trading centers, Hedeby in what is now northern Germany, Kaupang in Norway, Birka in Sweden,
Ribe in Denmark, and later Jorvik in England, Dublin in Ireland, were sophisticated commercial settlements with organized market areas, specialist craft production, and connections to trade networks spanning thousands of miles. These were not primitive barter markets. They were complex commercial environments with their own infrastructure and social rules. And women were in them. The archaeological evidence from sites like Birka and Heideby shows women's presence in the trading centers through the artifacts found in their graves, imported objects from far away, scales and weights for measuring silver, craft tools suggesting specialist production. Women who lived in these trading settlements were embedded in the commercial culture of the place. Some Norse women were traders themselves. The evidence is not extensive. We do not have names, mostly, but the presence of scales and weights in women's graves is telling. In a silver-based economy where every transaction involved weighing metal, you did not carry scales unless you were using them. A woman buried with scales was a woman who weighed silver in life. She was trading. The Norse trading culture also involved the production of specialist goods for sale. Combs made from antler, a common Norse craft product found across the trading networks, were produced in organized workshop settings. Amber beads, Baltic amber was highly valued across the medieval world, were worked and traded. Textile goods, as we have already discussed. The women who produced these goods were engaged in the commercial economy, whether they physically attended markets or sold through male intermediaries. There is also the question of Norse women in the slave trade, which is an uncomfortable but necessary part of any honest account of the Norse commercial economy. The trade in enslaved people was one of the most significant commercial activities of the Viking Age, and Norse women were involved in it, as owners of enslaved people, as managers of enslaved workers, and sometimes as sellers of enslaved people that raiding parties had brought back. The fur and slave trade along the Volga routes, which brought enormous quantities of Islamic silver into Scandinavia, was partly sustained by the sale of enslaved people to buyers in the Abbasid Caliphate and elsewhere. Norse women who ran households with enslaved workers were participating in this economy as managers, however removed from the initial act of acquisition they may have been. This is not a comfortable part of the story, but it is part of the story. The same iron key ring that symbolizes a Norse woman's authority also locked the chest where the silver from the slave trade was stored.
We cannot talk about Viking Age women without talking about magic, because Norse religious and magical practice gave women a specific, socially important, and somewhat alarming role that had no precise male equivalent and that represented one of the most unusual forms of female authority in the medieval world. The Seidr, usually anglicized as Seid, was a form of Norse magical and divinatory practice that involved entering a trance state to access knowledge, influence events, or communicate with supernatural forces. It was associated with the goddess Freya, who was the original practitioner and who had taught it to Odin, who had then taught it selectively to humans. And it was practiced, in the Norse worldview, almost exclusively by women. The practitioner of Seidr was called a volva, a seeress, a prophetess, a staff carrier, a woman of prophecy. The name comes from the word for a staff or wand, which was her primary tool and symbol. She was a specialist, a professional in the broadest sense. Her function was recognized, valued, and compensated by the community. She traveled from farmstead to farmstead, invited in advance, welcomed formally, given a seat of honor, a high seat called the Seidhaller was prepared for her, and asked to perform her art. The ritual of Seidr involved the volva sitting on her raised platform, while other women, her assistants, or women of the household who were willing to participate, sang specific ritual songs called wardlakker, the ward songs or guardian calling songs. These songs were meant to attract the spirits and forces that the vulva needed for her trance work. Not everyone knew the songs. They were a specialized knowledge, and their proper performance was considered essential to the ritual's success. In her trance, the vulva would answer questions put to her by the household. What will the harvest be? Will this illness be survived? What fate awaits this child? Where has the lost property gone? Will the voyage be safe? These were practical, urgent questions for a community that operated in conditions of significant uncertainty, where the margin between a successful year and a catastrophic one was often narrow. The vulva's answers were not entertainment. They were, for the people asking, navigation tools. She was paid for this service, with food, with hospitality, with goods. The social contract of the vulva's visits was clear and mutually understood. She provided something valuable. The household provided compensation. This made her economically independent of any single household in a way that most Norse women were not. She was not anyone's wife. She was not anyone's daughter in the functional sense. She was her own entity, moving through the social world on her own terms, beholden to the community in general, but to no specific family in particular. This was unusual. For a woman to have this kind of social mobility and independence in a society that organized women's lives so thoroughly around household and family relationships was remarkable, and it was allowed, encouraged even, because the function she performed was considered genuinely necessary. The most famous literary account of a vulva is the Voluspa, the seeress's prophecy, which opens the Poetic Edda, the collection of Old Norse mythological and heroic poetry that is our primary source for Norse mythology as a systematic worldview. The Voluspa begins with Odin asking a dead vulva to tell him the history of the world and the fate of the gods. She does. She tells him everything, from the creation of the world through the present age to Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the end of the world as it is, and what comes after. She does not tell him out of fear or compulsion. She tells him because she agreed to, and she frames her telling very much as something she is doing on her own terms. The voice of the Voluspa is one of the most powerful voices in Old Norse literature. It is authoritative. It is cosmic in its scope. It is not entirely sympathetic to its audience. The vulva is not Odin's servant, even in this extraordinary situation. She is his informant, his consultant, the one who knows what he needs to know and who will tell him if she chooses to. The power dynamic is complicated, and the poem is aware that it is complicated. This is a great god, king of the Norse pantheon, at the mercy of a dead woman's knowledge, because the dead woman knows more. That is a remarkable image to place at the beginning of your culture's primary mythological collection. It says something about how the Norse thought about the relationship between female knowledge and male power. It is not a simple relationship. The woman knows things. The man needs them. This creates a dependency that the poem does not try to smooth over. There is also the figure of the Gandraid, the spirit ride or magical journey associated with female magical practice. Norse magical tradition included the concept of shape-shifting and spiritual travel, the idea that a practitioner could send her consciousness out to gather information or influence events at a distance. This was closely associated with Seidr and with women who practiced it. The fear of the Gandraid, of a woman sending her spirit out at night to cause harm, was a real fear in Norse communities, and it was reflected in legal protections against accusations of this kind of magic. The legal codes contain prohibitions against falsely accusing a woman of being a night rider, someone who traveled magically by night. The prohibition was there because the accusation was serious and potentially harmful to the accused woman's reputation and standing. But the prohibition itself tells us that the accusation was made. People believed these things happened, or believed that some women were capable of them. The physical vulva, the traveling seeress, and the feared night rider were the two ends of a spectrum of female magical power in the Norse imagination. One was welcomed, compensated, respected. The other was feared and potentially criminalized. Both reflected the same underlying idea that women had access to forms of power that were not available to men in the same way, and that this power was simultaneously valuable and dangerous. The vulva's staff, the symbol of her office, has been found in women's graves. Iron staffs, wooden staffs, elongated implements that appear in high-status female burials with no obvious practical use, which suggests a ritual or symbolic function. The Oseberg women were buried with a staff. A woman found at Klinta in Sweden was buried with an elaborate decorated staff. Several other high-status female burials in Scandinavia include staff-like objects. These are probably vulvars, or women of high ritual status, being buried with their most important professional tool. The staff goes with them into the afterlife, because that is who they were. That is what defined them, and whatever comes after, they will have their staff.
The Norse religious world was rich and populated, and the goddesses within it were not decorative additions to a male-dominated pantheon. They were powerful, specific, actively worshipped, and cosmically significant in ways that shaped how ordinary Norse women understood their own place in the world. Freya was the most important of the female divinities, and she deserves considerably more attention than she typically gets in the popular retellings of Norse mythology. She was the goddess of love, sexuality, fertility, and also of war and death. She received half of all warriors slain in battle, the other half going to Odin. She was the original practitioner of Seidr, the founder of that magical tradition. She was associated with cats, with gold, with amber, with falcons, with desire in its broadest sense. She wore a necklace called the Brisingamen, which was the most beautiful object in the world, and which she had bargained 4 nights with 4 dwarves to obtain. And the later Christian tradition found this transaction so scandalous that they interpreted it as a moral failing, which tells you more about the Christian tradition than it does about Freya. Freya was not a gentle goddess of love in the sanitized modern sense. She was powerful and knowing, and completely comfortable with her own power. The myths involving her are not primarily stories about her being rescued by male gods. They are stories about her wanting things and arranging to get them, or being desired by others and successfully refusing them, or asserting her value in ways that the other gods could not ignore. When the giant Thrym demanded Freya as his price for returning Thor's stolen hammer, the god's response was not, "We'll give him Freya." The response was absolutely not, and they came up with an elaborate scheme involving Thor in a bridal veil, which is honestly the most entertaining subplot in Norse mythology, rather than hand Freya over as property. She was worshipped widely, and the cult of Freya had specific female practitioners and female associations. The vulva, as we have discussed, was associated with Freya and her magical tradition. Women who practiced Seidr were, in some sense, continuing the work that Freya had begun. This gave female magical practice a divine sanction. It was not deviant or peripheral. It was taught by a goddess. Frigg, Odin's wife, was the other primary Norse goddess, and she represents a very different kind of female power. Where Freya was active and mobile and assertive, Frigg was powerful through knowledge and restraint. She knew the fate of all things, and she did not tell them. This is a remarkably interesting form of power. She had the information. She chose to keep it. The silence was deliberate. The knowledge was hers, and she used it selectively, at times of her choosing, in ways that she determined were appropriate. In the myth of Baldur's death, Frigg extracted oaths from every object in the world not to harm her son. Every plant, every metal, every stone, every living thing, except the mistletoe, which she overlooked because it was young and small and seemed harmless. This oversight allowed Loki to engineer Baldur's death. Frigg's grief over Balder is one of the most direct expressions of parental love in all of Norse mythology, and her failure to protect him is presented as a genuine failure, not just a plot device. She knew almost everything. Almost was not enough. The Disir, the female ancestral spirits of the Norse religious world, were perhaps the most intimate of all the divine figures because they were tied to specific families, specific farms, specific bloodlines. The Disir were the female forebears of a family who after death continued to influence the fortunes of their descendants. They could bring good luck and protection if properly honored. They could bring misfortune if neglected or offended. They were not distant cosmic figures. They were the grandmothers and great-grandmothers of the people honoring them, still present in some form, still interested in the family's welfare. The Disablot, the sacrifice to the Disir, was a winter festival, one of the major religious observances of the Norse year, and it was primarily women's ritual. The women of the household organized and conducted the ceremony. They made the offerings. They invoked the ancestral women. In this specific religious context, women were not secondary participants in someone else's ritual. They were the primary agents. The ceremony was theirs. The Nornir, the three fate women who sat beneath the world tree Yggdrasil and wove the destinies of all beings, were perhaps the most powerful supernatural entities in the Norse cosmological framework, because they were beyond the authority of the gods themselves. Odin could not override the Nornir. He could seek knowledge of what they had woven, through the vulva or through his own sacrifices and journeys. He could not change what was woven. The three women, Urd, what has become, Verdandi, what is becoming, and Skold, what shall be, sat at their loom and they wove, and what was woven was done. The universe was a textile, and women made it. This image is not subtle. The Norse intended it not to be subtle. The most fundamental act of Norse women's daily labor, weaving, was also the fundamental metaphor for the structure of fate and time. A Norse woman at her loom was, in a small and domestic way, doing what the Nornir did. The parallel was understood. The resonance was intentional. For Norse women living within this cosmological framework, the message was not that they were small and powerless in a universe controlled by powerful men. The message was considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. The universe was structured by female agency. The gods navigated it. The women, the Nornir, Freya with her knowledge of Seidr, Frigg with her complete knowledge of fate, the vulva speaking prophecy, the Disir watching over their families, were the ones who understood how it actually worked. We have spent the majority of this night with free Norse women, with the Husfreyja and the Volva, and the saga heroines and the settlers and the traders, and we should spend this time with them, because they are the women about whom we have the most evidence and whose lives shaped Norse society in visible, traceable ways. But we must not leave the thrall women in silence, because to do so would be to repeat the same erasure that history performed on them the first time. Slavery was a fundamental institution of Viking Age society, not a marginal practice, not an occasional aberration, a fundamental institution. The Norse economy, especially the aspects of it that funded the wealth we see in the archaeological record, ran significantly on enslaved labor. Norse raids brought back enslaved people from Britain, Ireland, Scotland, France, the Frankish Empire, and the Slavic lands. Norse traders sold enslaved people along the Volga routes into the Islamic world. The market for enslaved people was large, well-organized, and central to Norse commercial life. Thrall women existed at the absolute bottom of Norse social hierarchy. They had no legal rights, none. They could not own property. They could not testify in legal proceedings. They could not initiate divorce because they could not enter a legal marriage in the first place, at least not in the formal Norse sense. They could be bought and sold.
They could be inherited as property. They could be killed by their owners, although this was probably uncommon, not for moral reasons, but because thralls were expensive, and destroying expensive property is economically irrational. The sexual exploitation of thrall women was routine and unremarked. They had no legal recourse against it. Children born to thrall women were themselves thralls, regardless of who the father was, which meant that a free Norse man who fathered children with thrall women was simultaneously creating property for himself. The Norse law codes acknowledge this in the specific terms they use for these children. It was legal, it was normal, it was deeply, comprehensively awful. We know about thrall women from legal codes, from the sagas, from foreign accounts, and from archaeology. The Irish annals record with consistent horror the taking of women as captives during Norse raids on Irish monasteries and coastal communities. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, writing his account of his encounter with Norse traders on the Volga in 922 CE, describes the slave trade in detail that is difficult to read comfortably. He describes the slave girls who accompanied Norse traders. He describes the treatment of an enslaved woman at a Norse ship burial, the ritual killing of a thrall woman to accompany her dead owner, with the thoroughness of an ethnographer who is simultaneously appalled and determined to record accurately. The account of the ship burial ritual that Ibn Fadlan witnessed is one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of a Norse burial we have. The enslaved woman who was killed in the ceremony, who may have been asked if she was willing, though how voluntary any consent can be in conditions of absolute power imbalance, is a question Ibn Fadlan asks around but never directly, was, at the conclusion of the ritual, killed and burned with her owner on the ship. The ceremony was elaborate. The community participated. It was, by the Norse cultural framework, an honor. The thrall woman was accompanying a great man into the afterlife. It was also, by any humane measure, a murder. There is no way to write about Viking-age thrall women that is not uncomfortable. There is no bright side. They were enslaved. Their labor funded the civilization whose free women we have been admiring. Their bodies were available to anyone of free status who wanted to use them. Their children were property. Their grief, and they must have had grief for families left behind during raids, grief for freedom lost, grief for children who would grow up in the same condition, was not recorded because no one thought to record it. We owe them acknowledgement. We owe them the honesty of saying this was part of the same world. The husfreyja with her peas and the thrall woman grinding grain in the longhouse were both there, in the same building, in the same economy, in the same story.
Before we cross the Atlantic, let us first go east, because the great river highways of what is now Russia and Ukraine were another arena in which Norse women's stories unfolded, and they are stories that rarely appear in the popular accounts of the Viking Age. The Norse who traveled east were called the Rus, a name that some scholars derive from a Finnish word for the Norse, Rutsi, and which eventually gave its name to Russia itself. The Eastern Norse traders established settlements along the river routes from the Baltic Sea south to the Black Sea and the Caspian. They traded at Constantinople, which they called Miklagard, the Great City, and with the Abbasid Caliphate, exchanging furs, honey, amber, and enslaved people for silver, silk, spices, and luxury goods. The archaeological evidence from Norse-influenced sites along the eastern routes, particularly from Birka in Sweden and from settlements along the Russian rivers, shows women's presence in the trade world. The Rus trade caravans included women. Some were traders' family members who traveled with commercial expeditions. Some may have been independent traders or the partners of powerful merchants who managed their own commercial interests. And some, most painfully, were enslaved women being transported south as trade goods, a category of female presence that we must acknowledge, even as it is among the most difficult parts of this history to sit with. Ibn Fadlan's account from 922 CE includes descriptions of the dress and behavior of Rus women with a specificity that suggests direct observation. He describes the oval brooches and bead necklaces that we recognize from Norse women's graves across Scandinavia. He describes women participating in the religious rituals of the Rus trading community, making offerings, praying before their wooden figures of the gods. The Norse religious life, including its specifically female dimensions, traveled east with the traders. The enormous quantities of Islamic silver that flowed back into Scandinavia along these eastern routes transformed the material culture of Norse society. Many of the silver arm rings and neck rings and elaborate brooches that we find in Norse women's graves were made from melted down Eastern silver, Abbasid dirhams, Byzantine coinage, converted into jewelry at the hands of Norse silversmiths for Norse women to wear. The silk that appears in high-status Norse burials, both male and female, came from the East along these same routes. Norse women who wore Eastern silk and Islamic silver were embedded in a global trade network that stretched from the Arctic to Baghdad, from Newfoundland to Byzantium. They may not have been aware of the full extent of this network, but they were wearing it, and their appetite for beautiful, exotic, prestigious goods was one of the economic engines driving those trade routes. The demand side of the Viking Age trade economy, the communities back home whose tastes and expectations made the trade worthwhile, was shaped significantly by women. The husfrega, wearing her Baltic amber beads and her repurposed Islamic silver brooch, was the market. Her preferences mattered. Her expectations shaped what was worth acquiring. This is a dimension of Norse women's economic role that rarely receives attention because it is not dramatic. But economics does not require drama to be significant. The aggregate demand of thousands of Norse women for quality jewelry and exotic fabrics was a real economic force, and it connected those women to a world much larger than their individual longhouses.
Let us sail now. Let us go west. Let us follow the Norse expansion across the North Atlantic and find the women who went with it, who made new homes in places no humans had ever lived before, who crossed open ocean in wooden ships with children and animals and everything they owned, and who arrived on the other side and got to work. The settlement of Iceland, beginning around 874 CE, was not a male expedition. It was a migration of households. Whole families, sometimes multiple families, packed into long ships and smaller vessels and sailed into the open Atlantic. They brought their cattle, they brought their sheep, they brought their dogs and their cats and their pigs and their grain seeds. They brought their tools, they brought their enslaved workers, and they brought their women. Iceland, when the Norse arrived, was empty of human habitation. Irish monks called Papar had been there briefly, but they had left or been displaced, and the island was otherwise uninhabited. This meant that the Norse settlers were not arriving into an existing social structure. They were creating one from nothing. And the women who arrived with the first settlers were therefore founding women in a quite literal sense. They were the mothers of a new population. Their decisions about where to live, how to manage resources, how to organize their households in a new and challenging environment, shaped everything that followed. The Landnama book, the Book of Settlements, written down in the 12th century but drawing on older records and traditions, lists the original Icelandic settlers by name. It names approximately 430 settlers by name, of whom around 13 are women who held land in their own right. 13 women out of 430 is not very many, but it is more than zero, which is what you might expect in a society that was theoretically organized around male heads of household. Among these women settlers, Aud, the deep-minded, is the most prominent, and we have already spent considerable time with her. But there were others. Thorun Hirna, Thorun the Peaked, her nickname possibly referring to a hairstyle or a physical feature, settled land in the north of Iceland. Steinunn the Old settled land and was known as a significant landowner. Various other women appear in the settlement records as landholders, sometimes in their own right, and sometimes in the context of estates they managed after a husband's death. The women who settled Iceland were engaging in a fundamentally creative act. They were building a society from the ground up, in a place with no existing infrastructure, no existing social hierarchies, no existing anything. The decisions made in the first generations of settlement shaped Icelandic culture in lasting ways. The legal traditions, the social structures, the oral poetry traditions, the storytelling culture that eventually produced the sagas. The women of the settlement generation were part of this creative work. They were not just following along while men decided things. In the context of early Icelandic settlement, there was no one to follow. Everyone was deciding things simultaneously. Iceland's climate and geography were different from mainland Scandinavia in ways that required adaptation. The volcanic soil was fertile in some areas, less so in others. Geothermal activity was startling to new arrivals: hot springs, geysers, occasional earthquakes. The winters were harsh but shorter and somewhat milder than Norway, which was a mixed blessing. The growing season was limited. The resources available: fish, seabirds, whale occasionally, limited timber, required adjustment from the farming practices of Scandinavia. Norse women adapted. They are documented adapting in the Islandingasögur, the sagas of the Icelanders, in the incidental details of daily life that the saga tradition preserves. Women managing farms in a new landscape. Women mediating between their husbands and their neighbors in a community where everyone was new and social hierarchies were still being established. Women making decisions about resource management in conditions that were unfamiliar. Then there was Greenland, which we have touched on and should return to. Eric the Red, who was genuinely red-haired and genuinely difficult to get along with, discovered Greenland in the early 980s CE after being exiled from Iceland for the second time in his life. He spent 3 years exploring the coastline and then sailed back to Iceland to recruit settlers, presumably with a certain amount of enthusiasm that glossed over the fact that Greenland was in fact Greenland. He departed Iceland with 25 ships. 14 made it. The others turned back or were lost. The people on those 14 ships, and there were women among them because these were household migrations, not raiding parties, arrived on the southwest coast of Greenland and began the work of establishing farms in one of the most challenging environments in the Norse world. Norse Greenland lasted for approximately 500 years. At its height, it supported somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people in 2 main settlement areas, the eastern settlement in the far southwest and the smaller western settlement further north. The settlers maintained contact with the outside world through occasional ships from Iceland and Norway, traded walrus ivory and furs and other Arctic products for iron and timber that Greenland could not produce itself. And they built churches in the Romanesque style that their mainland counterparts were building at the same time. The women of Norse Greenland lived in the most isolated European settlement in the world. The ships came infrequently. News from the wider world was months old by the time it arrived. The community was small enough that everyone knew everyone. Resources were limited. The climate was unforgiving, and they maintained a functioning society there for 500 years, which is by any measure an extraordinary feat of organizational resilience. We do not have sagas set in Norse Greenland in the way we have sagas set in Iceland. The Greenlandic settlers did not produce the same literary tradition. What we have are the Greenlandic chapters of the Vinland sagas, the accounts of the voyages to North America, and the archaeological record, which has been extensively excavated over the past century. The house farms of Norse Greenland, recovered through excavation, show a society maintaining Norse cultural patterns in miniature. The longhouse form, the livestock, the textile production, textile tools found at Greenlandic sites. The material culture of a Norse farming society adapted to local conditions. The women of these farms were doing the same things their Icelandic and Scandinavian counterparts were doing: textile production, food preparation, dairy management, healthing, organizing, managing, in rather worse weather, with considerably less timber, and with the Atlantic Ocean between them and the nearest significant population center. The last recorded event in Norse Greenland is the wedding at Hvalsey Church in 1408. Two witnesses later testified about this wedding before a Norwegian court, establishing the date and the names. The bride was Sigrid Bjornsdottir, and the groom was Thorstein Olafsson. They were married in a church that still stands, roofless but otherwise largely intact, on the Greenlandic coast. The ceremony, by the witness's account, was normal. A normal Norse wedding in a Romanesque stone church at the edge of the habitable world. After 1408, nothing. The Norse Greenland settlements disappear from the record. The most recent theories suggest a combination of factors: climate cooling, the collapse of the ivory trade when elephant ivory from Africa became more available in Europe, conflict with the Inuit people who had been moving into Norse territory, declining contact with mainland Scandinavia, and a gradual population decline that passed below the threshold of viability. But the exact end is unknown. We do not know what happened to Sigrid Bjornsdottir. We do not know whether she witnessed the end or was part of a community that had already dwindled to nothing before the final disappearance. She was the last bride in Norse Greenland. That is almost all we know about her.
We cannot discuss Norse women and exploration without spending adequate time at the very edge, at Vinland, at the place the Norse called the Wineland or the Berry Land, on the coast of North America in the early 11th century. The Norse presence in North America is not a legend, it is historical fact, confirmed by the archaeological discovery of the Norse settlement at Lawso Meadows in Newfoundland, excavated by the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Ann Steen Ingstad, beginning in 1960. Lawso Meadows is a Norse settlement from approximately 1000 CE, a small collection of sod buildings in the Norse style, containing Norse artifacts, including a bronze ring pin, a spindle whorl, and various other objects. It was inhabited for a relatively brief period, probably used as a base for further exploration rather than a permanent settlement. The existence of this settlement confirms the broad outlines of the Vinland sagas, the narratives in Grænlandinga Saga and Eric's Saga that describe Norse voyages to North America. These sagas give us names and personalities and narrative details that are clearly shaped by oral tradition and literary convention, but they are describing real voyages to a real place. The details diverge between the two sagas. They tell somewhat different stories about who led the voyages and what happened during them, but both include women as participants. Freydis Eriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red, is the most vivid and most troubling of the Norse women in the Vinland narrative. She appears differently in the two sagas, and the difference is so extreme that it is worth dwelling on. In Grænlandinga Saga, Freydis is a villain. She travels to Vinland with two Norwegian brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, on a joint expedition. The arrangement sours.
Disputes arise over the sharing of resources, and Freydis, in the saga's account, engineers the murder of the entire Norwegian party, men and women both. When the men in her group refuse to kill the women, Freydis takes an axe and does it herself. She then threatens her crew with death if they ever speak of it, and she returns to Greenland attempting to enforce silence. Leif Erikson, her half-brother, learns what happened and refuses to take action against her. The family connection stays his hand, but declares that her descendants will never prosper. The saga treats Freydis as a straightforward monster. There is no redemption, no mitigation, no complexity offered. In Eric's saga, Freydis is almost the opposite. She is brave, decisive, and saves the Norse expedition from disaster. When the Norse encounter the indigenous people of North America, called Skraelings in the sagas, a dismissive Norse term, and the men flee in panic, Freydis cannot run quickly because she is pregnant. She picks up a sword from a fallen man, exposes her breast, and beats the sword against it. The Skraelings, startled and perhaps genuinely frightened by this unexpected display, turn and flee. Freydis has saved the expedition through sheer force of personality and audacity. Two sagas, the same woman, completely opposite characterizations. What is happening here? The scholarly consensus is that neither portrayal is straightforwardly historical. Both are shaped by literary convention and, more importantly, by the cultural anxieties of the saga writing period about women who exercise power aggressively. The villain Freydis in Grænlendinga saga represents a common saga trope, the woman who instigates violence, who uses feminine wiles and family connections to commit acts that the cultural framework considered inappropriate for women. The hero Freydis in Eric's saga represents a different common saga trope, the exceptional woman whose masculine boldness saves the day. Both are types, not people. The real Freydis Eriksdottir, if she existed as a historical individual, which is possible but not certain, was probably somewhere between monster and hero. She was a person. She went on voyages. She was in North America, probably, or someone like her was, and the storytelling tradition worked with her memory until she became something the tradition could use, one way or another. But she was there, in Vinland, on the coast of North America, 1,000 years ago, whoever she actually was. And the spindle whorl found at Lonso Meadows, small, plain, unremarkable, was used by a woman, a Norse woman, spinning thread in North America around the year 1000 CE. We do not know her name, we do not know anything about her, but she was there, and she was working, and the spindle whorl in the Newfoundland soil is her monument as surely as any runestone.
Every discussion of Viking women arrives here eventually, and it is better to arrive at it deliberately than to trip over it accidentally. The Shield Maidens. Were there Norse women warriors? Did women fight? The honest and complete answer is nuanced, and nuance is not always what people want when they ask this question, but we will give it anyway, because it is late, and we are all past the point of pretending. The literary tradition of Norse female warriors is ancient, extensive, and deeply embedded in the culture. The Valkyries, the supernatural women who rode over battlefields, selecting the slain, escorting warriors to Valhalla, are central figures in Norse mythology. They are not human, but they are warriors in a cosmic sense, and their literary descendants, the human shield maidens of the sagas and heroic poetry, inherit their martial attributes. Hedivor, the heroine of Hervarar saga, is one of the most compelling of these figures.
She is born to a warrior father and a mother of high status, grows up restless and aggressive in ways that her society does not entirely know how to accommodate, and eventually breaks into her father's burial mound to reclaim his cursed sword, a scene of considerable mythological significance, since approaching a burial mound was dangerous, and approaching one at night was the kind of thing most people refused to do. Having obtained the sword, Hervor raids and fights and commands, and eventually settles into a more conventional female role as a chieftain's wife and mother, which the saga treats as a natural trajectory rather than a defeat. Brynhildr, in the Volsunga saga cycle, is a Valkyrie made human, cursed by Odin for disobeying him, sleeping behind a ring of fire until Sigurdr wakes her. She is the greatest of the Valkyries, the most powerful warrior, and also the most tragic figure in the saga, trapped between her love for Sigurdr and the marriage she makes to Gunnar, torn by contradictions that the saga framework cannot fully resolve and does not try to. Her final act is to throw herself on Sigurdr's funeral pyre, a warrior's end, chosen freely. Saxo Grammaticus, the Danish chronicler writing in Latin in the late 12th century, describes a class of women in the Old Norse world whom he calls Amazons, women who dressed as men, practiced arms, and fought in battle alongside male warriors. He is applying a classical framework to Norse material, which is itself a kind of distortion, but the material he is applying it to clearly had some basis in the Norse oral tradition he was working from. The historical evidence for actual women warriors as opposed to literary constructs is more limited and requires careful handling. The Birka grave, BJ 581, is the most discussed case. A warrior's burial, weapons, horses, gaming pieces, was identified as female through DNA analysis in 2017. The individual was biologically female. The burial was furnished as a warrior's burial of high status. What this tells us is that someone in Viking Age Birka decided that a woman should receive a warrior burial. Whether she was actually a warrior in life, or whether the burial reflected some other aspect of her status or role, military leadership, noble lineage connected to warrior traditions, some ritual or symbolic dimension, we cannot determine with certainty from the burial alone. There are also Byzantine accounts of women found among Norse dead after battles, armed. There are saga accounts of women taking up weapons in specific crisis situations, defending homes, defending ships under surprise attack, that are presented as exceptional but not impossible. There are the genetic studies of Norse-era burial populations that have, in several cases, identified biologically female individuals in contexts that earlier archaeologists assumed were male. The picture that emerges is not a picture of regular female participation in Viking Age armies. The systematic evidence for that does not exist. But the picture is also not a picture of absolute impossibility. Women who found themselves in combat situations through circumstance, who had trained in arms as part of an unusual household or personal situation, who led military forces in some capacity, these are not impossible in the Norse context, and there are hints of their reality scattered through the evidence. The most intellectually honest position is probably this: Norse women existed in a culture that had female warrior figures deeply embedded in its mythology and heroic tradition. That culture produced real women of considerable capability and sometimes considerable boldness. In a world where violence was not distant and occasional, but near and regular, some of those women picked up weapons. How many, how often, in what formal or informal capacity, we do not know, but the Shield Maiden was not entirely fictional. She was mostly literary and occasionally, probably, real.
The Christianization of Scandinavia changed everything. And it changed things for women in particular in ways that are worth tracing carefully, because the change was neither simple nor uniform. Christianity arrived in Scandinavia gradually, unevenly, and over a long period. The process began in the late 9th century with missionary activity in the trading centers, where contact with the Christian world was most intense, and extended through the 10th and early 11th centuries as Norse kings converted, usually for political reasons, because conversion brought legitimacy in the European Christian world and access to alliances that were otherwise unavailable, and then applied more or less coercive pressure on their subjects to follow suit. The conversion of Norway is associated with Olaf Tryggvason, who became king in 995 CE and proceeded to Christianize his kingdom with an enthusiasm that was not always entirely gentle. Iceland converted in 999 or 1000 CE, technically through a legal decision at the Althing, which is at least consistent with their generally procedural approach to everything. Denmark and Sweden converted through their own processes, with their own timelines and their own complications. For Norse women, the Christian conversion brought a genuinely mixed set of changes. Some were improvements, at least in theory. Christianity emphasized the spiritual equality of men and women before God in ways that Norse paganism, with its rather pragmatic view of the divine-human relationship, did not quite mirror. The Church offered women the option of religious life, the convent, which, for women who chose it, provided education, community, and sometimes genuine institutional power, since abbesses could be significant figures in medieval society. The Church also had a complex feelings about the female religious roles that had been central to Norse women's spiritual life. The vulva, the disoblot, the Sade tradition, the cult of the Disir, all of these were incompatible with monotheistic Christianity and were condemned as paganism and sometimes as diabolism. The female magical religious practitioner, who had been respected and compensated in the Norse world, became increasingly suspicious in the Christian world. This suspicion would eventually culminate centuries later in the witch trials that devastated European communities. But the path to that darkness began with the Christianization that made female ritual authority illegitimate. The Norse women who lived through the conversion period, who were raised in the old tradition and converted or were converted in their lifetime, were navigating a genuine cultural rupture. Some embraced Christianity wholeheartedly. The archaeological evidence suggests that some women were among the earliest enthusiastic converts in Norse communities, drawn perhaps by the spiritual equality that Christianity promised, and by the specific devotion to the Virgin Mary, a powerful female figure in Christian spirituality. But some kept the old practices, maintained the old knowledge, continued the old stories. The process of Christianization was never complete overnight. It was slow, uneven, and full of compromises.
We are nearing the end of our night together, and I want to spend some time here in the archaeological record because it is the most direct evidence we have for who these women actually were. The sagas are literature. The law codes are aspirational. The archaeology is what people actually buried, what they actually made, what they actually wore and used and valued. It is the closest thing we have to the reality. Women's graves from the Viking Age have been found across an enormous geographic range, from Norway and Sweden and Denmark, the heartlands of Norse culture, to the settlements of Britain, Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, Greenland, and the eastern routes through Russia. Wherever Norse people went and settled, they brought their burial practices with them. And those burial practices tell us, consistently and across enormous distances, what mattered. The Oseberg women, whom we met at the beginning of this night, are the most elaborate example, but they are not isolated. high-status female burials with rich grave goods appear across the Norse world from the 8th century through the 11th. The Thun ship burial in Norway, another ship burial, smaller than Oseberg but still remarkable, may have contained a woman, though the remains are too fragmentary for certainty. The Skar burial in Orkney contained a woman in her 40s or 50s, buried in a boat with a man and a child, along with a remarkable collection of objects: a pair of antler combs, a weaving sword, needles, a brooch, a lead weight. A productive, probably prosperous woman, buried with the evidence of her work and her status. The Vale of York treasure, not a burial, but a hoard, contains objects that may have been owned by a Norse woman. Silver items of extraordinary quality, some with runes scratched onto them. The runes on some Norse silver objects appear to be ownership marks, and in some cases, the ownership marks can be identified as female names. Silver belonged to women. Women had silver. This was not remarkable. The Valhagar finds from Gotland, a Swedish island that was a major center of Norse trade, include remarkable female burials with enormous collections of silver jewelry, particularly the elaborate penannular brooches and beaded necklaces that were the characteristic dress of Norse women of means. Some of the Gotlandic female burials contain more silver than most male burials from the same period. The silver economy of the Viking Age was not exclusively a male economy. Women accumulated silver. Women wore silver. Women were buried with silver. The spindle whorls are everywhere. Every Norse settlement site, every Norse burial context with female remains. The little circular weights that balanced the hand spindle, made from clay or soapstone or occasionally bone or antler, turn up in Norse contexts across the entire range of Norse expansion. They are small and humble and ubiquitous, and they are among the most eloquent objects in the Norse archaeological record. Every spindle whorl represents a woman spending part of her day spinning thread. Spinning thread every day, year after year after year. The accumulated labor of all those spinning days is not dramatic. It is the substance of a civilization. The cooking equipment, the knives, the bowls, the ladles, the strainers, the practical apparatus of daily food production found in women's graves across the Norse world. Not glamorous, completely essential. This is what she did every day. This is what she was known for. This is what someone thought should go with her when she left. And the imported objects: Byzantine coins, Islamic silver, Frankish glassware, Irish metalwork. These appear in Norse women's graves, not just in men's graves. The trade networks of the Viking Age connected Norse communities to the wider world, and the goods that came back along those networks were not all weapons and shipbuilding supplies. Some of them were beautiful things, luxury goods, objects of distant craftsmanship that made their way to Norse farmhouses and eventually into Norse graves. The Norse woman wearing an Irish brooch, found in Norse graves in Scandinavia, was wearing an object that had crossed seas and cultures to reach her. She may have known its origin, she may not have, but it was hers. There is also, in the archaeological record, the evidence of violence against women. Female remains with healed or unhealed wounds, evidence of difficult lives, arthritis in early middle age from years of hard physical labor, dental wear from grinding coarse grain, healed fractures. The physical cost of the life these women lived is written in their bones, and the bones do not soften it. This was a hard world, and living in it was hard work, and the work left its marks. But they also left marks of their own,
on the landscape, in the genetics of contemporary populations, in the legal traditions that their society built and modified, in the oral traditions that eventually became the sagas, in the spindle whorls that turn up from Newfoundland to the Russian steppe. They were there. They worked. They endured. They sometimes thrived. They were not footnotes.
There is one more thread to follow before we truly settle in for the night. It is the thread of legacy. What Norse women left behind, not just in the ground, but in the culture of the places where they lived and settled and raised children. In Iceland, the legacy of the settlement-era women is most directly traceable. The Icelandic sagas were written in Iceland by Icelanders about Icelandic ancestors, and the women in those sagas, the vividly drawn, psychologically complex, often formidable women of the Íslendingasagur, reflect something about how Icelandic culture understood and remembered women's roles. A culture that had been built by women like Odd the Deep-Minded did not forget that women could found settlements, manage estates, make decisions, and be worthy of detailed literary attention. The saga tradition remembered its founding women with something that looks, across the centuries, like respect. In the British Isles, Norse women contributed to the genetic and cultural foundations of communities that are still identifiable. DNA studies of populations in Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, and parts of Ireland and northern England show substantial Norse ancestry in both the paternal and maternal lines, which tells us that Norse women settled these places in significant numbers. They were not just the mothers of Norse men's children, they were Norse women themselves who came and stayed. Their descendants are there today. Their genetics are in the contemporary populations of these islands. In Normandy, as we have noted, the Norse women who settled with Rollo's followers in the 10th century were the mothers of a Norman French culture that then spread to England, to southern Italy and Sicily, to the Holy Land with the Crusades. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, which is conventionally the end of the Viking Age, was in some sense a Norse cultural export, carried by the descendants of Norse settlers, including the maternal lines, into the English-speaking world. The English language itself carries Norse traces. Hundreds of common English words are Norse in origin: sky, window, egg, knife, husband, law, anger, ugly, awkward, gate, thrive. The word for a female householder in Old Norse, husfreyja, is the etymological ancestor of the English word hussy, which originally meant simply a housewife or female head of household, and acquired its later derogatory meaning through a long process of social judgment applied to women who were too independent. The word started dignified, it ended up an insult. That trajectory is itself a small history of how society's attitude toward assertive women shifted during the medieval period. The Norse women who spun and wove and brewed and managed and settled and occasionally sailed and occasionally wielded swords and occasionally spoke prophecy in trance states, they are gone. But they are not entirely gone. They are in the genetics and the language and the legal traditions and the stories. They are in the Icelandic parliament that descends from the Althing they attended. They are in the common law traditions that carry traces of Norse women's property rights. They are in the memory of a culture that, at its best, looked at a woman running a farm or sailing a ship or speaking prophecy and thought, of course she can. Why not? That is the legacy, and it is worth staying up very late to honor. It is very late now, or very early. The fire has burned low, the ale has been drunk, the thread has been spun, for tonight at least, and the spindle can rest. We have spent a long time with the women of the Viking Age. We have visited their longhouses and their farms, their legal assemblies and their markets, their graves and their myths,
their practical daily labor, and their cosmic significance in the mythology of their culture. We have met the extraordinary ones, awed the deep-minded, sailing calmly across the North Atlantic, Gudrun Osvivsdottir carrying her grief into old age, Freydis Eriksdottir being terrifying in whichever version of the story you prefer. And we have tried to see the ordinary ones, the Hagenhildras of history, grinding grain and making ale and spinning thread every day, and leaving no name behind except occasionally on a runestone. What do we carry forward from tonight? Perhaps first, that the popular image of the Viking Age as a monolithic warrior culture organized entirely around the activities of raiding men is incomplete in ways that matter. The warriors were real, the raids were real, but they were components of a larger, more complex social organism. And the women of that organism were not incidental, they were structural. They were the load-bearing walls of a civilization that the popular narrative spends almost all its time on the roof of. Perhaps second, that legal rights and social reality are not the same thing, but they are related, and Norse women's legal rights tell us something important about how their culture valued them. The right to divorce, the right to own property, the right of a widow to become her own legal guardian. These were not trivial. They were systems that the Norse built because they thought women needed them and because they acknowledged that women's contributions to society were real enough to protect. Perhaps third, that the spiritual and cosmological framework of Norse religion gave women a place in the cosmic order that was not subordinate or marginal. The Nornir wove fate. Freya understood the deepest magic. The Volva spoke prophecy that the gods themselves needed. The Disir protected their families across the threshold of death. A Norse woman living within this framework was not living in a world where the divine order told her she was lesser. It told her something considerably more complicated than that. Perhaps finally, that the women we remember best from the Viking Age, the saga heroines, the notable settlers, the Volvur with their staffs, were remembered because they were extraordinary. But the women who kept things going, who maintained the farms and raised the children, and spun the thread and brewed the ale and ground the grain, were not extraordinary in any theatrical sense. They were extraordinary in the way that most human beings are extraordinary, which is, they kept going. Day after day, in difficult conditions, without recognition or drama, they kept everything running, and everything kept running because of them. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the largest thing, the thing that everything else depends on. The long ships are silent now. The longhouses have gone back to the earth. The runestones stand in fields and museum corridors. The spindle whorls are in glass cases. And the women who made all of it possible are mostly names we do not know, in graves we have not found, in stories that were never written down because no one thought to write them. But they were there, and now, at least for tonight, so were we. There is something worth pausing on right here at the end of the night. We live in an era that is deeply interested in recovering the stories of people who were not at the center of the historical narrative that earlier generations chose to tell. Women, enslaved people, the ordinary, the overlooked. And sometimes this project of recovery feels new, something our generation invented. But the Norse world, in its own limited and imperfect way, was already doing this work. The sagas were already writing Gudrun and Bergthora and Odd and Hervor into the record. The runestone carvers were already inscribing women's names into permanent stone. The people who buried their dead were already insisting that the woman with the spindle and the key ring and the healing herbs deserved a grave as carefully prepared as any warriors. They did not do it perfectly. They did not do it consistently.
They did not do it for the thrall women, who deserved it as much as anyone. They did it through the filters of their own culture, with all their hierarchies and biases intact. But they did it. And we are still doing it, here, tonight, in the middle of whatever night this is for you, listening to the story of women who have been gone for 1,000 years. We are still making the argument that they were there and they mattered, and the story is incomplete without them. That argument never really gets finished. It just gets made again and again, in different languages and different forms across the centuries. Tonight, we made it in a YouTube video about Viking women that you listen to while falling asleep. 1,000 years ago, someone made it by putting a key ring in a grave. The scale is different. The intention is the same. Sleep well. The thread will wait until morning, and so will history, all that remains of it, all that is still being discovered, all the graves not yet excavated, all the rune stones not yet found, all the names not yet recovered from the past. They are there. We will find them eventually. Thank you for spending this night with the women of the Viking Age. If you genuinely enjoyed this journey, if the company of Aud the Deep-Minded and Gudrun Osvivsdottir and the unnamed Husfreyja with her keyring was good company for the late hours, then please like the video and subscribe. It means more than you might think, and I will see you at the next long, quiet night of history.